let's go ahead and get back to our current guests, Frank Feschino Jr., Alfred Lehmberg. Thank both of you guys for being here tonight again, and it's an honor to have you both on talking about this topic and the research that Frank you've put into it, and Alfred, it's just amazing how much there is about this topic.
Well, you'll certainly get no argument from me.
Let's, if we could, Frank and Al, for the people that we kind of talked about in the first hour, of course, all the UFOs, kind of the government, the government involvement, the Air Force involvement, and again, as you both stated right before we went on NBC News, how when the craft crashed in Flatwoods, how they just happened to know how to get there so quickly in a back way in. Can we kind of talk a little bit, if it's okay, and if you want to move things around, that's fine, but about the creature and maybe some of the players involved, kind of some of the details, because I read about it, Frank, and I've listened to many shows that you've been on, and Al, you've been on talking about this, and this thing trolling around out there, and then, of course, now this alien, this reptilian, trolling around for a day or so would scare the living heck out of most people.
Well, what happened is when the object was seen going down, Pat, it landed about 25 minutes or half an hour after it passed over Washington. What it did is it actually overshot Flatwoods and went to northern Braxton County on a western trajectory. Then it turned and headed south towards Flatwoods. It was flying at treetop level and barely clearing the mountaintops from the witnesses I interviewed before it flew into the Flatwoods area. Now, when it passed over Flatwoods, it flew over the local Flatwoods Elementary School playground. And at that point, it was approximately 7:25.
What day of the week was this, Frank?
Okay, this was a Friday night.
Friday night, okay.
Yeah, the kids from the neighborhood were playing their pickup ball. There was a whole group of kids. And what happened is this thing flew over their heads as they're playing ball. It turned, made a 45-degree angle, passed over the local road, barely cleared the treetops, en route to flying over the Bailey Fisher farm. It stopped in midair and kind of dropped flatwise. It just kind of like flipped over and ascended down. Now, when it touched down, the whole area was aglow. Some of the kids were yelling it was a meteor. Some of them said it's a flying saucer, a UFO. They didn't know. The kids on the field were in range from like 6, 7 years old up to 17, 18 years old. That was the big thing to do. There's not much to do in 52 in central West Virginia. You have to remember, and this is an important point, only a couple of radios in all of Braxton County. There was a couple of cars. One of them was the sheriff's car, and the other one was Ailey Stewart Jr., who was the co-owner of the Braxton Democrat. He's the one who covered the story in the press. And, you know, everything was horse-drawn carriages. The people lived off of the land. There was a little general store. This was isolated backwoods West Virginia. And like Alfred said earlier, there was no interstate back then. There was only secondary roads. And to get to one location, you know, as the crow flies a couple miles, sometimes you had to drive a half an hour, 45 minutes just to get there through these backwoods.
Yeah.
You know, not accessible. So these kids saw this thing go down, and they all stopped immediately, started screaming and yelling. They ran up the street approximately a mile to the May home, which was on Depot Avenue, and that was along where the railroad line was. Two of the boys in the group, Eddie May and Freddie May, this was their home. They busted through the front door, and it's kind of like a little rascal scene with all the kids excited and screaming and yelling. They come trampling through the door, and they're all screaming to Kathleen, "We saw something up on the back hill that went down." They wanted to go see it. So Kathleen May went up there, and she had a flashlight. She told the boys to calm down, and a whole group of them deciding they're going to go up into the back. It's starting to get dark. It's pretty much dusk at this time. And Gene Lemon.
Can I interrupt
was,
and
yeah,
confirm
sure,
that
Al. Jump in, man.
that there were two adults in this crew, and the other
Right.
adult being around 17 or 18 years old?
Right, Gene Lemon. He was the cousin of Kathleen May. She was 32. 32. So we have two adults in this group.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have another piece of information that came into the story. There was a collie dog from the neighborhood who went up with Mrs. May and all the boys, and there was also a couple dogs that accompanied them. So there was a whole wagon train of kids going up. And I was told by the Flatwoods residents, I was given more names, there were several more kids that actually went up than the few that were reported. But they were told to keep quiet. And in days following, intelligence was up there telling everybody to shut up. So basically, in the long run, we had Kathleen May, Gene Lemon, Neil Nunley, he was a 14-year-old boy, Teddy Neal, 13, Eddie May, 13, and his brother Freddie, 11. We had Ronald Shaver, 10, and then there was a little kid who was up in the neighborhood. He wasn't actually playing ball with the kids. He was a little 6-year-old kid. He kind of tagged along and went up with the whole group. So we have this big collie dog leading the pack with the two adults and a wagon train of kids going up there. The rest of the kids, I have a few names and I reported it in the book, but there's not much known about it because they were told to be quiet if you know what's good for you. So the parents just shut up.
Right.
So basically, in the long run, we have 8 witnesses going up onto this Bailey Fisher farm to see what went down on the back part of the property. Now, to lay out the whole land area, Pat, and Alfred's been up there several times with me on a couple shoots and whatnot, and when you step onto this farm area and you look across the farm, there are actually 3 fields. The first field is a completely level, flat field. The second field is a gully. The third field is up on a plateau, which I would call, it's like a small mountaintop or hilltop. So we have 1, 2, 3. Where this thing was seen to go down, Pat, it was up on the back plateau, which is a completely level area. It looked like it was just lopped off the top of a mountaintop. That's where the kids saw this thing go down. So they're looking to go up there, approximately another mile walk. Now, along the left-hand part of the Bailey Fisher farm, there's a path. The group is walking across this big open field, and the kids keep yelling, they saw this thing go down way, way back there. So that's their destiny. They walk up to this big fence. It's a metal fence. And that part of the farm is cordoned off because there's animals and horses and cows that would be up there grazing periodically throughout the year. So Mrs. May and the kids get to this big fence. They open it up. The collie runs through the fence. All the kids start piling through it, and they're following the adults. And they have 2 flashlights. At this point, they did not have their flashlights on. It wasn't dark enough at that point. And I remember Mrs. May telling me years ago, one day we were having lunch, she says, when you were going up into those woods, you do not, the batteries sucked back then. They weren't too good.
Right, right.
You did not waste your battery juice unless you actually needed it. And they had planned on walking another mile to the back, so they didn't have their flashlights on. And they were accustomed to walking through the woods. These kids grew up there. So they're walking through the fence. Now they walk onto this area, Pat, and it's called, the nickname, it was called a wagon trail. It was a wagon path. And this is where the farmers went back and forth with the livestock and brought their wagons and, you know, whatnot, their farming implements. And they closed the gate behind them because they didn't know at that point if any of the Fisher animals were on the farm. So they wired this gate shut. And Mrs. May and Lemon are leading the path, okay? They're going uphill. And it's craggy, and it basically looks the same now as it did back then. Okay, they're walking up this windy path, and they get a few feet up into the woods. Now, the woods are on the left-hand side now, and the gully is down on the right-hand side. They're looking back up, approximately a mile away. They're looking way up there for this thing. Well, what had happened, Pat, is when this thing touched down on the top plateau, it actually lifted and relocated and went into the gully of the farm, and there was a pear orchard back there in the back portion of the property, and it was tucked away back in there, and you couldn't see it too well. Some of the younger kids didn't see this thing parked back in the gully. A couple of the adults saw some flashing. They saw this pulsing, intermittent pulsing. So they're confused at this point, but the kids are just excited. They want to go see what touched down on the back. So they start walking a little bit further, and they start smelling this horrendous sulfur smell, and it's starting to gag them. And it's a low flowing gas that's coming through the area.
The fog is heavier than air.
Yeah, and it's like a fog, and it's a little bit misty, and it started bothering them. But they kept pushing on. They had no idea what it was, but it wasn't something that they were accustomed to. It wasn't your normal West Virginia early evening fog. You know, it smelled like rotten eggs, basically.
You kind of said it, I think you mentioned one time, like a road flare almost.
Pardon?
Like a road flare, like the sulfur smell you get from a road flare.
Exactly.
Right.
And Freddie May told me in an interview, he says, and besides that sulfur smell, it smelled like burning metal and the old test tubes when they would burn out, too. He also mentioned to me in one interview when we were on the farm, Pat, he said he noticed as he was walking up the path, he heard this low droning noise turning into a high pitch, and he didn't know what it was. And when he worked at Union Carbide as an adult, he said the first time he heard those big compressors shutting down, it was that whining down noise. He said he heard that coming from the field, and that's where the craft was parked. It was like whining down, like this humming, droning noise. So they're moving along. They don't know what's going on. Now it becomes a little bit confusing. You have the smell. You have this droning and whining noise out in the distance. The dog who's leading the way, this big collie, takes off like a bat out of hell, runs into the mist, and it goes flying up the path and disappears around the bend, and they can't see it. They come up to a second barricade, and this is a wooden gate, and it doesn't swing, but this gate actually has two big posts, and there's slats nailed. The highest one was between 3 and 4 feet high from post to post, okay? We have these slats there. Mrs. May and a couple of the boys got up to this area and started to climb over it. Meanwhile, the dog turns around, and it's barking and runs back down the hill again. And it runs past all of them. And it's going back in the other direction. Something up there scared it. So it takes off. It heads back towards the house. And Mrs. May and a couple of the boys get to this wooden fence. Now the smell's getting stronger, okay? At that point, they climb over the fence, and they start going up around this, what Mrs. May told me is a swag. And it veers to the left, and then it's a straight shot going back up towards the back of the property. So Mrs. May and Lemon and a couple of the boys are walking up along. Mrs. May's older son's with them, and Neil Nunley. As they start walking up a little bit more, it's getting intensified with the smell. This foggy mist is starting to get stronger. It's starting to bellow out. They look up towards their left, and the origin point of this, there's a big, gigantic oak tree, and it's well over 100 feet tall. At that point, they're nearing this tree. Freddie May, who I had interviewed several times, told me he stayed back. He had not reached and went over that fence. He had just about hit that wooden fence, and he saw the rest of the group moving up ahead. He was getting ready to climb up over it with one of the other kids, and he looked straight up ahead, and that's when he saw his mom, Kathleen, and Lemon had directed their flashlights up towards the left. Now, behind this tree, Pat, about 12 feet up in the air, they saw what they thought were eyes of a raccoon. Because what the heck else is going to be up there 12 feet in the air?
Right.
So they now, because they have to remember, the woods are against, this is the tree line, so it's a little bit darker in there because it's dusk. So they didn't get a good, clear shot of what was there because it was in the shadows. They redirected their flashlight up to this area where all this smoke and stuff is emanating from. This smell's getting stronger. They aimed their flashlights, and they hit this thing with the beams of the light. And what it was, well, they were shocked. Lemon fell over and screamed and fell over backwards. He just got rubbery-legged. And they saw this big 12-foot-tall mechanical device standing there next to the tree. Had no feet. It basically looked like the lower portion of a booster rocket with a big head with an ace of spades covering over it. And what it was some type of a hovercraft machine. And you could see inside this glass barrier area where the head section was an inner helmet that was red, and it had two big giant porthole eyes like a helmet. When they hit this thing with the beams, the inside of this machine lit up, and it made an odd noise, and the witnesses said this thing lifted straight up from the air about a foot to a foot and a half, and it reacted. The beams shot from the eyes. Now, they weren't Buck Rogers laser beams and all that crazy stuff. What they were, it was Freddie May later on, he told me, he compared it to a modern car when you turn the car on with the ignition,
right.
how the lights light up from the inside. They're either blue or orange or yellow or green. He said that's what this thing did. It lit up and glowed from the inside, and the light was forced out through the eye porthole openings. So this thing reacted to them. It hovered down the little inclination area where this oak tree was, and it passed right in front of Mrs. May. Now, meanwhile, this thing, it must have been damaged because it was making this, Mrs. May said it was making this low thumping noise like hitting a silver dollar against a stretched canvas, like a rhythmic thumping noise. She said, but it was splattering oil and shooting oil out. It seems it was some type of a leak pad. And she was the closest one. Lemon was next to her, except he fell down. He was just totally shocked. He freaked. He fell down. And all the boys that were up close to this thing were covered in oil. It splattered on their faces. It went all over the front of Mrs. May's uniform. She had like a beige work uniform on with a little hat, and this whole thing got splattered, her whole outfit. Now, this thing moved in front of Mrs. May. It moved in front of Lemon, and it went past the boys. It actually moved from their left to the right, and it went back down the hill towards where the craft was parked out in the distance. Now, Mrs. May told me at one point she was so scared when she saw this thing, and I said, how close were you, Kathleen? And she said the length of a car, a small car. So basically, this thing almost came out over on top of them. That's how close they got to it, because it was hidden behind the tree path to their left. And they got that close up to it, and then when they hit it, it reacted and moved down in front of them. So she said it was the length of a car, a small car. And they all turned. One of the kids helped Lemon get up off the ground because he was basically in shock. And he got a real good whiff of this thing. What it was some type of a propulsion system. And it actually was capable of lifting this craft. Freddie May told me at the shoulders, this thing was over 3 feet wide, and it flared out to over 4 feet at the bottom. Basically like a booster rocket.
Yeah, yeah.
And it had these pipes coming down that went around a lower circumference, equally spaced, and the head area was 10 to 12 feet high, and it had a glass barrier in front of it, almost like the windshield of a car. And he had likened it one conversation when I sat down. I was working with him on a drawing, and he says it almost looked like looking at a fighter pilot inside the cockpit of a plane, where he has his helmet on with his visor pulled down with his oxygen mask on. He said this thing had an inner helmet with porthole eyes, with he said like a plexiglass or glass barrier, and this big ace of spades covering over the top of its head. They got a really good look at it. Now, when I did my illustrations and I was working with the different witnesses, it was really great, Pat, because I worked with Mrs. May, who was the closest one to this thing. So she gave me a pretty good up-close and personal detail of what this thing looked like. And then Freddie May, because he was towards the back end of the pack, he saw the whole thing unfold in front of him. So when I was working with these witnesses and figuring out the dimensions and how far from point A to point B and where everybody was on the path, you know, it was great to have all these different points of perspective. So they all turned and ran back. Mrs. May said she got so scared of seeing this thing, she had no idea what it was. When she reached that wooden fence, which was 3 to 4 foot high, she said she cleared it like she was in the Olympics. And she passed several of the kids on the way down the hill. So here she is wearing a dress. She dove and cleared it in one shot. And she said I passed several of them down the hill. It was basically every man for himself.
Did this thing, Frank, did it harm any of them, or did it wave its arms at them or come at them, or was it just sort of hovering around?
It didn't have arms.
Okay.
The drawing that was depicted was incorrect. That's the one that through the media, and it was shown a week on television, a week later on TV. It was drawn wrong. The artist misinterpreted the witnesses' descriptions. It didn't have arms. The arms where they would have been were actually some type of small antennas. Gotcha. They were sticking out from the shoulder area. It didn't have arms. When it was seen with arms was the upper portion of the spacesuit was removed the next night, Pat. That's when it was seen 17 miles away in Frametown. Mrs. May and the kids ran back down the hill, and that's when they got into the house, and that's when she called the sheriff's department. Lemon was really messed up pretty bad. He got a good whiff and mouthful of this stuff. And he was
if I could interrupt here too, and say sure. That consider that this being, and presuming that it was a shot down alien aviator, damaged, perhaps even wounded, that its reaction to the population encountering it was still relatively benign in all of the occasions where this thing is encountered.
Yeah, there was never any aggressive movements, Pat.
Right.
You know, it just kind of reacted. And I was very adamant when I was interviewing Mrs. May in her testimony. I wanted to know, did this thing react to you? Did it harm you? Did it do anything? Mm-hmm. And she said no. It didn't harm us. It didn't make any aggressive movements. It just wanted to get back to its craft, and it passed in front of them. And what had happened in the subsequent investigation by Ailey Stewart, who was the Johnny on the spot, and the next day...
And the owner of the local newspaper, by the way.
Right. He was up there that night. He was there the next day, and Colonel Levitt was also up there that night. Everybody talked about these big marks in the grass. Mm-hmm. They called, incorrectly, they were called skid marks because they looked like sled marks going through this tall grass. They weren't skid marks. What these things actually were is it was the grass, Stewart told me and Levitt told me, was basically knee to waist high, okay? And picture having a big, gigantic leaf blower and walking through the grass and holding it down what this craft was some type of a hovercraft, and the propulsion system had actually carved on its way from where it touched down and where it had relocated, Pat. It moved outside the craft, and it cut a path going up to the tree. When it departed the area, it followed its path or its footprints back towards the craft. That's why you had a set of parallel paths, one up to the tree and one away from the tree going back to the craft. And there was a big area set down as well where this thing had touched down. What's interesting, and I spoke with Stanton Friedman about this, he found this really awesome, is that even though this thing was seen in flames flying over Flatwoods, it was a big fireball. Even though it was seen in flames, when it touched down, Colonel Levitt told me where this thing was down in that area when they researched and investigated the area, there were no burn marks. There were no burn marks whatsoever, even though it was seen seconds before in flames.
Wow.
And Levitt said none of the leaves were burned in the area, the grass wasn't burned, everything was just pressed down. And there was also pieces of metal found in the tracks. The oil was splattered all over the field. And it was also, Levitt told me, there was a big puddle of oil that sat where this thing was hovering, where it lifted up and came back down the path. So when they all went back down to the house, Mrs. May, that's when she called the sheriff. When she called the sheriff's department to report this, the sheriff was not in. He was out with the deputy. You know, it's kind of crazy what had happened, that there were calls and reports of crashes going on throughout Braxton County up and down the river from Flatwoods. There was actually another craft that had come in. It was a damaged craft that came in from the area of Florida, and that was where Colonel Levitt went later. But what was happening, Pat, is the sheriff was going out to point A, then driving back to the sheriff's department. When he got back to the sheriff's department, he got another call to go out further. So he's running back and forth like a chicken with his head cut off, getting all these different reports. And what it was another craft that was puddle jumping and trying to get out of the area, which subsequently
I think what we're supposed to take away from this is that the police were called by Mrs. May, and they could not respond because they were dealing with their own UFO issue.
Right.
That's exactly right. So they're dealing with all of this, and actually, I'm going to throw in real quick, Alfred. A couple of times I was up there when I was writing the book and trying to get all of this timeline together. I actually retraced the exact path because the roads are the same. They haven't changed much from 52, same roads and same routes. I actually retraced and figured out the time points in between of how long it took the sheriff to go back and forth and back and forth. That's how I was able to detail the book and get it hammered down pretty close. I was just reliving everything. And Pat, I was working with a lot of the old-timers, you know, over the past 20 years.
Sure.
You figure back in the early 90s, a lot of them were alive. So they kind of took me under their wing, and they showed me the ropes, and I would drive around with them, and they would show me the different points and the different shortcuts and this and that and the other. You know, so I really got involved in this to get this timeline down pretty tight. But what had happened is while all of this is going on, the state police were also tied up. They were unavailable. And I don't know what happened with the state police. But the next thing we know is Ailey Stewart, who was the co-owner of the Braxton Democrat in Sutton, which is the town next over to Flatwoods, he got a call from the state police because he was a photojournalist. He would run around with the police. He had a big, beautiful, fancy camera, and he would assist the police going to crime scenes, you know, accidents, and he would take the police photographs. So he was pretty buddy-buddy with all these cops. So he was chosen to be the representative, and he went up to the May house that night on behalf of the police. The police were nowhere to be found, so Stewart went up there, and I tracked Stewart down years ago before he passed away. He had heart problems, and I actually stayed at his house for quite a few days in North Carolina. He lived up in Kill Devil Hills, and I hung out with him, and it was really cool to sit down, and he's the one that actually broke the story to the world. And I stayed at his house for days and just sat there and shot the breeze with him and took notes and notes, and I interviewed him. And you could see that in parts of it in my documentary because I had to edit it, Pat. But it was really great, and he was basically the backbone to this whole story because he told me all the inside information of what happened. He was the first person to actually sit down and interview all
One of the things he did in interview, too, was to separate the kids out, really give them the third degree, confirm the similarity of their stories, and had them draw the monster, and each of the four kids drew something that was remarkably similar.
And that's absolutely right. And what else he told me is he tried tripping these kids up, Pat.
See if they were telling stories.
Yeah, and you'd say, no, but I thought one of the kids said I had a square head, and he said I had a triangle head, and they were like, no. He was on purpose trying to trick them up. And he said they always came back to the same story, and he had them drawing sketches, and he was convinced something had happened up there. Well, when he came onto the scene that night, there was actually a posse formed, and they went up there. Now, you have to picture this scene of all local townspeople. Mrs. May's dad, Joe Lemon, he went up there with a shotgun. Stewart told me you did not drive around anywheres up there unless you had a couple guns. He had a shotgun. He had handguns. So here goes this posse looking up into the woods, and he sees all these kids all freaked out. They're screaming.
Got to be prepared for those big owls.
Yeah. Yeah, the government's explanation. So they go walking up into the back. Now, that had to be kind of scary, walking into the pitch blackness. I don't even like going up there doing video shoots during the day. It's still creepy up there.
Yeah.
Let alone going at night, and you don't know what you're going up there up against. So here goes this posse up there all armed, and a couple of the boys had actually went up there, and he grabbed Gene Lemon because they wanted to know exactly, because that's a big farm. They wanted to know where it was. And he said that one of the boys was crying like a whipped pup. He was like a little schoolgirl. He was wimping out, and he was crying like a little kid. He didn't want to go up there. And this was an adult. And they kind of grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and said, boy, you show us where it happened. And there's this posse lined up behind them, and they marched them up the hill, and they walked up there. He said he had electric lanterns, the big giant 9-volt lanterns, and they went up into the area. Now, he was in the military, Stewart, so he knew that gas would settle. And the kids and everybody back at the house were talking about that horrendous smell in the gas. So he had knelt down on the ground and then laid on his belly, and he smelled the gas was still in the area, was still prevalent. And he spotlighted around, and he told me that night he actually saw the big marks in the grass because they were right next to the path to the right. And he said they were getting kind of nervous, and what he told me is they weren't too excited or looking forward to hunting for something in the dark in the woods of West Virginia at night for something they didn't know what it was. Wow. Because they were all convinced something happened. This wasn't a setup. This wasn't a misidentification of a barn owl in a tree. These kids were scared, and they were pretty freaked out, Pat. And he stayed up there for a little while, and they, the nerves got the best of them. And
sure.
a bunch of grown men with shotguns armed to the teeth were nervous up there because they knew something happened the way they saw these people carrying on. They went back down to the house, and the sheriff actually had come up a bit later the sheriff came up with dogs, and it was said through other investigators that the dogs would not go any further up onto the farm. And they turned around, and the sheriff never even went to the actual spot. They came back down to the house, and Freddie May told me he remembers looking out the window as a kid and seeing the sheriff's department up there with the light on the top. And he said the police were definitely there, Frank, and they never went up there. The cops never went. The deputy and Sheriff Carr never went up there. The dogs refused to go. So at that point, the sheriff kind of mocked everything, and he just split, and he left, and Stewart stayed there. And he talked to the witnesses. He took some notes, and he actually left the scene after about an hour and a half or so. He went and picked up a big tape recorder from the local theater, and he went back up there the next day, and he videotaped and interviewed them more in depth. Now,
well, he didn't videotape it.
This was all audio.
Okay.
And God only knows where the audio tapes are, Alfred. But a lot of this has been transcribed in the newspapers. You know, the Braxton Democrat, he was pretty in-depth with some of the interviews. But from that point, that evening, the Charleston Gazette, which was the key newspaper in the state capital, they got a contact about the story, but it was received late. The Flatwoods Monster story didn't appear until Sunday, and all the Saturday papers, all the follow-up stories, were not about the Flatwoods Monster. They were about UFOs and unidentified crafts flying up and down the eastern seaboard. So we had a lot going on that night, and that is some of the information I used through the newspapers. I combined all this information, and I figured out these flight path trajectories.
Frank and Al, we've got about little bit less than 15 minutes left. Can we talk a little bit about? Okay, so the night the kids they go out, they encounter this thing flying around, doesn't bother them, and they take off running, try to tell their story. Obviously, a lot of things are going on. But now, the next hour, or the next day, can we talk a little bit about the Frametown Monster? And we find out, from what I understand, there is something in this capsule that's flying around, and it makes an appearance.
That's correct. This story appeared in a magazine article. It was one of Men's Magazine, 1955, July. It was called Male Magazine. It had some sports stuff in there, different things to do with nature and hunting and, different stories. And I actually found an original copy of this article that was written, and it was called the West Virginia Monster. And there had been a little bit written up about this particular story over the years. And what it was about an alien encounter in Frametown. Now, Frametown's about 17 miles away, from Flatwoods. Well, I had tracked this particular craft after it departed Flatwoods, after the encounter with the May family and the boys. I tracked it going along the river, and it actually crashed in a hilltop area in James Knoll. Now, the following night, we have the Frametown incident, and it was a young family, George and Edith Snatowski. They were from New York. They were from Queens. They had went to Ohio on vacation. They were backtracking and taking the scenic route, according to them. And they were actually coming through Braxton County. They didn't know. They actually drove right through that particular area where everything had went down the night before. But the public was unaware of it because it hadn't reached the newspapers yet. this is Saturday night. Flatwoods happened on Friday. It didn't hit the Charleston Gazette papers and the Daily Mail until Sunday. So nobody knew what was going on. So they're coming through Braxton County. 24 hours later, George Natowski thought a chemical plant was on fire. It was some type of a sulfur smell. Once again, sulfur. He's coming down the road in Frametown, and his car mysteriously just dies. Now, he's getting all freaked out because here you are, it's dusk. He's from Queens, New York.
Right.
They're stuck in the mountains, and it's getting dark, and he's got a baby, 18-month-old baby. And in the back seat, back then they didn't have baby seats. They had, like, cribs, and they would just put the baby in the crib in the back. His young wife is there. They're getting nervous as hell. Here they are stranded in the middle of nowheres in the mountains. Well, they look out in the distance, and they see this big purplish glowing oval craft. It's a light, and it's bobbing up and down. It's the same description of a craft that was seen in Flatwoods the night before. It was basically shaped like an egg or an eggplant. It was ovoid shaped. And this thing is sitting out in the distance in a clearing in the woods, Pat, and it's got this purplish glow. Now, I'm making all these different connections here because when I interviewed Mrs. May, she remembered a purplish glow. When she was starting to go onto the farm, she said there was a big flare, and the whole farm lit up, and she saw over the crest walking up to the first pasture. Now we have George Natowski and his wife are talking about they see this purplish thing flashing and pulsing way out in the distance. So George jumps out of the car, and he's fumbling around with the battery. He's thought, well, maybe he had a loose connection, so he's fooling around with this. Well, in the meantime, this smell, which was the same thing noted in Flatwoods the night before, it's getting worse and it's intensifying, and he's carrying up a storm, trying to get this damn car started, and he's trying, no luck. He starts walking towards this thing out in the woods to see what it is. So he's walking through the clearing. The car was down on the side of the road. He had pulled it over. He walks out across this field, and he's walking through the woods towards this thing hovering out in the distance. As he started getting closer to it, Pat, he said that there was like low voltage electrical shocks, like pricklings going through his body, like he was getting electrocuted as he neared this craft. So what he did is he backed off. Well, meanwhile, he had got a whiff of this sulfur smell, and he started vomiting, and he went down to a knee, and he's throwing up all over the place, and he's steadying himself. He's getting this low-voltage shock going through his body. He's getting whiff of this sulfur smell. He's vomiting all over the place. He's leaning up against a tree, and he's trying to stabilize himself. He gets his wits back about him. He turns around, and he starts walking back towards the car. Now, in the meantime, the whole area has become engulfed with this sulfur smell, just like in the May case the night before. His wife had rolled up the windows because the baby was coughing and she was gagging, okay? So trying to isolate themselves from this because it was pretty sickening. His wife rolls down the window, and as George is making a beeline back towards the car, she starts going absolutely hysterical, freaking out and yelling at him, "George, look out, it's behind you." He turns around. He looks off to the side of the road. Coming down the road, parallel to the road from the woods area, towards him, right up behind him, is this 9-foot-tall alien entity. He sees this thing, and he told me, I spoke to him on the phone, basically his knees buckled. He almost had a stroke when he saw this thing. What he actually saw, Pat, was a large bloated body from the waist up to the head, It had some type of a weird-looking snake reptile head, and it had long, spindly arms, and they were disjointed. The proportions of the arm from the shoulder to the elbow and the elbow to the hands weren't in proportion to humans, and it had 2 fingers instead of 5 digits. This thing is coming towards him, and he's just like freaking out. He starts running back towards the car, and this thing is following him. What it actually was, it was hovering, he said, across the road, next to the road, right along the edge, following him. And what happened is he jumps into the car. He's freaked out. He takes his wife, and he pushes her down underneath the passenger side, like under the dashboard. You can do that in 52 cars, a lot of space in the front. And he reached into the glove compartment, and he had a big hunting knife. They took the baby, brought the baby from over in the back of the baby crib down underneath, and he laid over both of them. And he told me he was going out his head then. He was scared witless, and he said his heart was pumping and throbbing, and he said if he ever prayed in his life, he was praying now. And this thing had come up to the car. Now, he was laying on top of the baby and his wife holding this knife, and he's scared to look up because this thing made a beeline right towards him. What it actually did is it hovered around the car. What this thing was, Pat, this was the Flatwoods Monster seen with part of its spacesuit off. There was an upper torso from the waist region up to the shoulders. The helmet and the inner helmet were gone, but the lower portion of it, but the pipes were there. This thing is in the craft, and it circled around the car. Now, he didn't look up at this point, but the whole area is getting engulfed. The baby's screaming hysterical. His wife's freaking out. He doesn't know what to do. He's still laying down, and he's scared to look up. Finally, a couple minutes goes by, and he lifts his head up, and he looked through the windshield, and the damn thing was hovering in front of the car path, staring down at him.
Wow.
How scary was that?
Yeah.
And it had like a snake face, and he said, quote, unquote, it was a good 9 feet tall. So being an illustrator and talking with these people and taking all the different descriptions from all the archives and the articles, I did split images, and I built the spacesuit in my drawings, and I built models of this thing too. A 9-foot figure would fit inside a 12-foot tall spacesuit, and then you put a head covering over the top that's about 3 foot, so 9 and 3 is 12. That's what Colonel Levitt and all the witnesses said. That thing was close to 12 feet tall. They gauged it when they saw it in Flatwoods by a tree limb. Levitt stood there on a path with me and pointed at the tree, and he said it was 12 foot high, this limb, and then it arced down across the path towards the field. And Mrs. May said this thing had just barely got out from underneath the tree when she saw it. And Satowski said it was a good 9 feet tall. So that's how I kind of put all this information together, and this was actually the Flatwoods Monster.
Wow.
Frank and Pat, I sense we're getting close to the end here. How much more time do we have?
About
Pat?
a minute.
Okay, well let me.
We got to get you guys. We got to get you guys back again soon.
Yeah, in fact, I'll tell you what. A minute is not enough to go into what I wanted to go into, but it was just an indicator that something twitchy was going on in that area because they were invited on the most popular television program of the time in just the next few days, and their show was the second to the last show that program ever did, and it was inexplicably canceled, one of the most popular programs on television.
Unbelievable.
Yep.
For our listeners, they need to go check out Frank's site, flatwoodsmonster.com. Get the book, support Frank, all the work that he's done. Alfred, Frank, I want to thank you both for being here. I want to get you back on again. We need more time. It was an honor to have you both on as always, and thank you so much for sharing this and sharing your work.
Thank you, Pat. And thank you, Alfred.
We'll
call you tomorrow,
with
Frank.
you. All right. Take
Okay.
care, guys. Good night. God bless,
All right.
and we'll keep in touch.